Capcom's arcade classic, notorious for its difficulty, has captured the hearts and quarters of players for over 40 years now, myself included. And in my latest masochistic gaming endeavor, I've taken on the brutal task of beating every single game, port, and spin-off in the entire series, even including its surprising number of computer conversions and other obscure oddities, all to put together true first-hand comparisons and a bigger picture of the franchise as a whole. And oftentimes I went for true endings, no continues, or other sweaty gamer goals. And as you can guess, I died a lot. But with strength welling, I have pushed on, and I'm here to tell you about every Ghosts and Goblins game. Our journey begins with the original that started it all, first released in Japanese arcades in 1985 as Makaimura. Capcom had released a handful of arcade titles prior to this, eventually leading up to their breakthrough hit Commando, also in 1985, and that momentum of success would continue with Makaimura and its release in other regions soon afterwards as Ghosts and Goblins. The game's director, Tokuro Fujiwara, aka Arthur King or Professor F, would go on to be an integral part of Capcom's future success with his work on later game series like Bionic Commando, Mega Man, Resident Evil, and many others. And his affinity for making difficult but highly satisfying and addictive action games really shines here. But first, it starts with buying a credit and pressing start. You are Sir Arthur, just hanging out in your underwear with Princess Prin in a graveyard, when she's suddenly abducted by a flying demon and is being held captive by the evil Astaroth, king of the demon world. So you immediately suit up in your armor and things kick off. It's not a deep storyline by any means, of course, but it immediately demonstrates a key game mechanic that would reverberate through later games as well. If you get hit by an enemy or projectile, you lose that armor and you must continue the fight in your boxers, and one more hit reduces you to a pile of bones. Yeah, get used to that. At its core, this is a side-scrolling action platformer with a somewhat aggressive difficulty curve. Yet it masterfully pushes the delicate boundary of feeling unfair with leaving the player thirsty for the knowledge of how to survive the dangers ahead. And with enough unpredictability to keep experienced players on their toes with every run. Arthur scurries along at a consistent and moderate pace, and there's lots of screen real estate to give you an expansive view of the situation at hand. And you're also always armed with a projectile weapon with unlimited use. His jumping is pretty stiff, the leaps are committed once they start, and walking off of something will send you directly downwards. But a certain technique you'll quickly need to get a grasp on is his ability to turn around in midair and shoot in the opposite direction. It may seem like a subtle thing, but this flexibility to fire at your foes while jumping away from them leads to some very satisfying combat scenarios. And before we move on from the controls, there's one other lesser known technique worth having in your arsenal. So normally if you mash the attack button, you're not only limited to the number of projectiles that you can have on screen at one time, but you also have to wait a few frames before throwing another one. But if you tap the joystick forward rhythmically between your attacks, you can greatly speed up the attack rate. It's a great way to melt monsters and bosses with lots of health. Speaking of attacks, another very important aspect of Ghosts and Goblins is the variety of weaponry. Now, you can only carry one at a time, but the different types include the spear, sword, axe, torch, or the cross and shield. And you know, I always thought this was the dagger, thanks to some inconsistencies in later games, but apparently here, it's a sword. Anyways, each weapon has its own degree of usefulness, with the dagger, sword arguably being the best, with allowing for 3 on the screen at once. Or you've got the axe, which is able to pass through multiple enemies and thrown at an angle. Or you have the infamous torch, which leaves damaging flames on the ground and can do considerable damage. But if you don't know how to use it effectively, picking one up might be a fate worse than death, thanks to its shorter range and 2-sprite limit. And you do get stuck with the same weapon after you die. The cross is also pretty interesting, as it has a shorter range, but it can destroy incoming enemy shots. And a spoiler alert here, you must have a cross equipped in order to enter the final boss room. And if you're wondering about the difference between the cross and shield, there isn't a functional one. It's just a sprite swap between regions to avoid being blasphemous in North America. The overall variety of weapons is cool in that it really keeps things interesting between attempts, as you can often end up getting one dropped on you on accident, or maybe one is lying right in front of that ladder you need to use, and you'll have to change your strategy accordingly. And of course, all of these attacks would be pointless without hordes of monsters in your path to Prin Prin. You've got zombies popping out of the ground, man-eating plants shooting eyeballs at you, killer flying burritos, lumbering ogres, petite demons, and plenty more creepy creatures are scattered about the stages, all with their own unique behaviors and each presenting their own obstacles in combination with creative level layouts. And we have the Red Armor, the first really difficult enemy Arthur must face, and a character that was notably created before the core of this game even existed, laying the foundation for the other denizens of this spooky but light-hearted demon-infested world. The Red Armor would become somewhat of an anti-mascot for the series, even to the extent of the Armor Firebrand getting his own spin-off series. Now these Armors can move fast, they can shoot projectiles, and they quickly react to your movement. So it takes a healthy combination of fast reflexes and trial and error to be able to defeat them consistently. And even with hours of experience under your belt, there's rarely a dull moment fighting these guys. Honestly, I find this to be a great example of why this game's difficulty is so well designed. Always exciting and giving that addictive feeling of satisfaction from surviving a tense battle. Levels also end with a larger boss to deal with, like the Unicorn. Yes, that's a little singular horn on his head. Or you've got the Flying Dragon. Or we can't forget Satan, that red beast from the intro. Now these big guys get recycled and reused a bit throughout the game, but each showdown with them also gives that adrenaline rush like an armor fight, with a little sprinkling of randomness that will keep you guessing. The levels themselves also have a lot of character to them, with 6 stages total, connecting together as shown on the world map screen displayed in between every life. As you've seen already, the setting is mostly of the spooky variety, going from the graveyard to a dilapidated village, into a dank cave leading to a chasm of pitfalls and flames, and finally making your way up through Astaroth's castle. The level layouts are thoughtfully crafted, gradually introducing new enemies. There are also numerous hidden items to find, and also testing your movement skills with bits of platforming set pieces, and even some vertical exploration, often via ladders, which can be a formidable foe on their own. Now the graphics are really great for 1985, with a kind of cartoony style that is clear to see and keeps things from feeling too grim and serious. The lighthearted vibes are kind of welcome when a game is constantly trying to defeat you into submission. And the atmosphere also gels together nicely with the lively soundtrack, energetically spooky harpsichord sounds keeping the action flowing. And who can forget this now iconic Level 1 theme music? And technically, you could say this game has 12 levels, with its diabolical 2-loop clear required for a true ending to the game. As upon beating Astaroth for the first time, who is kind of a pushover honestly, the game pulls the rug out on your celebration by informing you it was all a trap devised by Satan, and to truly rescue the princess, you're gonna have to repeat all the stages again with a bump in difficulty. The average player may throw up their arms in disgust at this point, but there's some sickos that actually appreciate this. It's a dastardly but fun way to goad you into another playthrough, and this time you really gotta let your skills shine and prove to yourself that the first clear wasn't a fluke. And you'll just have to take my word for it, but beating 2 loops on 1 single credit feels so good.
Yes! Let's go!
The stakes are always high, and the odds are always against you. And by the story is happy end, you really feel the strong welling.
Woo!
There's a bit more beyond just beating the game too. You can of course go for high scores, or even push beyond the first 2 loops with scaling difficulty in every further loop. There are also lots of difficulty options in the dip switch settings, and also some fairly significant changes between different regional releases and revisions of the arcade ROM, of which there are currently known to be 8, even with one of them being newly discovered just a couple weeks after I got my first 1 credit clear of the game. So pick your poison, but for the most reasonable and bug-free version, you might be best off with Japanese Revision G. Beyond the original release, the arcade version of Ghosts and Goblins has been re-released in tons of collections and whatnot, with inclusions in Capcom Generations on the PS1 and Saturn, the Wii Virtual Console, Capcom Classics Collection, Capcom Arcade Cabinet, and most recently Capcom's Arcade Stadium. Or you even have stuff like this mildly cursed Jack's Pacific plug-and-play device. Now all of these basically play identically, and the more modern versions like Arcade Stadium do support features like rewinding, achievements, or online score leaderboards. But emulated versions aside, now it's time to dig into the world of weird and wild ports that were made to further the spread of Makaimura. And we'll start off with one of the most widely played and maybe reviled port for the Famicom and NES, released in 1986, published by Capcom, but with development outsourced to Micronix, who had also previously ported other Capcom games to the system, like Sonson, XX's, and 1942. Micronix would also become a bit notorious for later janky ports for other publishers, with stuff like Athena, Ikari Warriors, and Super Pitfall. But regardless, this very memorable port of Ghosts and Goblins is somewhat legendary at this point, being a huge seller for the system, selling over 1.6 million units, and it's not pulling any punches in the difficulty department, establishing its legacy as one of the toughest titles on the platform, and an often referenced example of what we now know as NES hard. Upon loading up the game, you'll immediately see a bit of a graphics downgrade, but keep in mind it is 1986, and at least it's undeniably still Ghosts and Goblins on the surface. Things get a little worse when you start moving, with a pretty choppy frame rate at around 20 frames per second. There's a very detailed video by Displaced Gamers that goes behind the code on why this happened, which is worth a watch if you're curious. But in a very brief summary, Micronix made some interesting choices here on how the game is programmed, likely in a time crunch to get the port finished and released in a timely fashion. Now top it off with some questionable collision detection, some obnoxious sound effects, and of course the unflinching difficulty, and you've got something to make little kids cry and give angry nerds something to rant about. At the time of release, it was very well received though. Now this game is jank, and maybe it's because this was the version I grew up with, but I'd contend it's still a commendable conversion, and it certainly captures the spirit of the arcade original, and not to mention it retains all of the levels and their layouts quite faithfully, and includes the required 2-loop clear for a true ending. Even the chaotic armor patterns transferred over pretty well, and it's worth noting a lot of the arcade-specific strats might not carry over exactly, such as the attack animation canceling, or some specific routes, boss strats, item locations, so you'll need to adapt accordingly. A recurring thing we'll be seeing in a lot of the other ports. Another somewhat creative change was made by making each of the bosses immune to one of the weapons. So in some cases you might need to find something else on the way. Difficulty-wise, I'd probably say this one is a smidge easier than the arcade, but to be fair, I did not try to 1cc this version in my own challenge runs. I instead made the poor life choice of trying to take on the loops beyond Loop 2, as the game does keep scaling the difficulty with faster and faster enemies, and the third loop alone almost broke me. After making ogres pace back and forth for hours in the final stage, while woody pigs were screaming murder in the background, I'll never look at a burrito the same way ever again. Now, there were some slight differences between the Japanese and North American versions. The Famicom does have a slightly slower attack speed to your projectiles, and there are fewer extra lives gained from points, and there's no continue option unless you know the secret button combination. So you might have a slightly easier time with the North American version. And if you're curious to try those extra difficulty loops like I did, there is a ROM hack called Ghosts and Goblins Plus that lets you pick whatever level and loop you want to start on. And once you get into the upper loops, man, it is absurd. Much like the arcade version, the NES port saw several re-releases over the years, like on the Wii Virtual Console, the NES Mini, and even a Game Boy Advance release in Japan as part of the Famicom mini-series. It was also the basis for an eventual Game Boy Color port, which we'll get into in more detail later, as that one had enough differences to warrant its own full playthrough and exploration. Beyond the NES port, Ghosts and Goblins would also see conversions on 8 different computer platforms, each with their own substantial differences depending on the technical limitations at hand. But while these days it may be easy to quickly dismiss these as inferior to the arcade original, I was honestly impressed by some of them, and I had a lot of fun seeing the modifications and learning how to conquer each one. Well, almost each one. Now, first up, the Commodore 64 version would be one of several 1986 released ports published by Elite Systems, with Chris Butler on programming duties, who had also worked on the well-regarded C64 port of Capcom's Commando, amongst plenty of other titles on the platform. Now, aesthetically, the sprites are simplified and the colors are very limited, but there's still a lot of detail and care put into the backgrounds, and the level layouts line up pretty well. And performance is actually quite good. It plays and scrolls along smoothly, better than the NES at least. But honestly, the controls feel a bit on the clunky side. Arthur's horizontal speed feels a bit sluggish, and there are some disagreeable hitboxes at times, but nothing overly bad here at all. And at least the torch weapon doesn't suck. Look at the range on that thing. And of course, a control scheme common to most of any of the computer versions we get into today, up is jump, which is fine once you get used to it, but it does cause some complications around ladders. I will say some of the enemy behaviors have been simplified greatly, so once formidable foes like the armor become pretty easy to read and predict in comparison to their erratic and adaptive movement in the arcade. Same goes for the bosses too. Once you figure out what to do, they're pretty much pushovers. What becomes the most dangerous enemy here might have to be the Woody Pigs. So many of them can be on the screen at once, and they just spawn relentlessly. One of the more memorable aspects of this port is actually the main theme song by Mark Cooksey. It's really quite different from the original, but it has a fun, silly, spooky vibe to it. But hey, you do get sound effects at the same time, which is not always a given on old computer games, so consider it a luxury in this case. An interesting limitation the devs faced here was Elite's requirement of having the game be able to run completely from memory, with no loading time during gameplay, so the number of levels ended up being cut down to 4 in total: the graveyard, the village, the fire bridge, and the cave, which was shuffled around to be the final stage. And rather than having to do 2 loops to get a true ending, it instead just infinitely loops these 4 levels with no changes. And the game doesn't let you continue, so just finishing one loop feels somewhat reasonable, I suppose. It's still no cakewalk though, and I suppose you could always use cheats to see the whole game with minimal frustrations. Overall, this one's really fun, a stout but fair challenge, and it was a big seller on the Commodore for good reason. I'll admit that I haven't had a ton of experience with Commodore games. It's something I'm trying to work on, but this is probably one of the better ones I've tried out. As a supplement to going through all of these official ports, I did want to check out some of the more recent fan-made unofficial conversions as well. And the 2015 Commodore 64 port by the Nostalgia crew was super impressive. It restores all of the levels, improves the graphics, and has an incredible soundtrack. Definitely an awesome project, and worth a look for Commodore and G&G fans alike. And the next elite port on our list is for another Commodore computer that I didn't even know existed until my deep Makaimura research began, the Commodore 16, an entry-level PC released in 1984 to compete with similar budget-friendly microcomputers from Timex and Texas Instruments. And with this being my first experience with C16, man, I hope it only goes up from here because this port is rough. The graphics look really busted. Arthur especially looks like a glitchy mess. There's no music, the physics are extremely basic, and the enemy behaviors are super primitive. The only thing here that barely qualifies as fun is that you can shoot lances pretty fast. That's the only weapon though. They also die in one hit, by the way. Armor doesn't do anything here. So the main hurdle is the unicorn boss, thanks to their attack pattern and their insane amount of health. The level 1 unicorn is tough, but you can beat him. But 2 unicorns at the end of level 2 are simply impossible to kill without cheating. They have too much health, and it's not physically viable to shoot them down before they jump on you and kill you. That's right, already on the 4th game of the challenge, and I hit a wall. When I was streaming this, I even attempted to rewrite the game code live with chat's help out of desperation. But even once you get invincibility enabled, there's basically nothing beyond those 2 unicorns. The level ends and you get the same flip the tape loading screen you would see after beating level 1. And the game just loops over again. Not even a congratulatory anything. Now I know this likely has some severe technical limitations it was facing, and I have to imagine the devs must have had very limited resources and time. Or maybe the wrong build ended up on the tapes. But man, this feels really unfinished and untested. I'm usually pretty forgiving to janky games, but man, sadly this one is just broken and not fit for store shelves. Now if anything positive came out of the C16 version, it was how I learned about another fan-made conversion for another Commodore computer I had never used before, the C4 Plus, which is kind of like a beefed-up C16 that was a little more expensive and targeted users of more serious and productive applications. And the C4 Plus remake of Ghosts and Goblins was really impressive. Quality-wise, it probably sits somewhere between the C64 original and that Nostalgia Crew remake. And it has all of the levels from the arcade version, responsive controls, solid graphics, and really fun music. Definitely recommend checking this one out. And next up is another port released in 1986 for another computer I have pretty limited experience with, the ZX Spectrum. It was a very successful computer in the UK and Europe in the early 80s, although as you may be guessing at first glance, it wasn't necessarily designed with gaming and graphics in mind. It has an interesting way of handling color, where each 8x8 block of pixels on the screen can hold a background color and a foreground color, along with other attributes. And there are 15 colors in total in the palette, giving Spectrum games a rather distinct look and creating an interesting limitation for game developers. Initial versions of the Spectrum also had a single-channel analog beeper for some very crude sound, so gaming on this platform has quite the uphill battle ahead of it if you compare it to other computers in that era. Despite this, the Ghosts and Goblins port absolutely slaps, once you get accustomed to a few things anyway. A good reminder to never judge a book by its cover. Aside from the funky color situation, the game actually runs really smoothly, with decent animations, smooth scrolling horizontally and vertically. The graphics have been redrawn, and while they can't compare to arcade quality by any stretch, everything is usually pretty clearly identifiable. Maybe my only complaint would be some of the items or enemies blend into the background if you're in an area with textured tiles. And to round out the aesthetics review, the sound effects are, basically farts. There's no music either, which is typical on the 48K Spectrum. Now, the controls are what you would expect and may vary depending on what you're using, but it did seem like some of my inputs would get eaten on rare occasions. It's hard to say if that's an emulator issue or not, though. Another thing that made this port quite challenging were the enemy behaviors. They seem to spawn or move in relation to your character's position on the screen. So some sections, like the imps at the start of level 2, can be a massive pain until you learn how to manipulate this. Luckily, things will be pretty consistent if you can manage to replicate your own movements and timings, so once you figure out something that works, you should be able to execute your safe route through the stage. As far as the game content goes, this has been trimmed down considerably to 3 levels, and the weapons include the lance, sword, and torch. Some enemies are missing too, no ghost burritos, and the unicorns have been replaced by jumping ogres, and bosses like the dragons, satans, and Astaroth are not present at all. The armors are still here though, and they are pretty feisty to fight with, sometimes even teleporting around to murder you ruthlessly. The levels include the graveyard and the village, which match their original layouts pretty faithfully, even down to their moving platforms. Oh, and one kind of funky thing here unique to this port, you can shoot the keys for bonus points. Now, the third and final stage somewhat resembles the original level 5, but it moves more horizontally than vertically. And it has an interesting twist, incoming spoiler alert. After a long ogre and bird infested hallway near the end, you'll see Prin atop a high platform guarded by 2 armors. So not only do you have to defeat both of them, all while birds are spawning, then you have to actually get up there. You can't jump that high. Now this took me a really long time to figure out, exacerbated by the game's lack of continues. I'm pretty sure you could jump onto that platform from another higher spot up on the left, but the route to get there is pretty insane, and leaping into that dual armor fight is usually going to lead to your doom. So I ended up going the lower way, tried to fight the armors one at a time, and then tried to damage boost my way up onto the ledge. It's hard to say what the devs intended you to do here, but quite randomly, I ended up victorious. And dead? Ultimate sacrifice bonus. That's right, you can beat the game by hurling your corpse at the princess. Let's go. Now I know it's possible to reach Prin alive, even potentially getting more bonus points if you miraculously still have your armor on. And while the game does loop over again, you don't need to beat it twice for a true ending. It's just more of the same. But man, this was a spicy challenge, clocking in at 748 deaths and a 13-hour grind. This port will surely test your patience, but in the end, I had a great time failing my way through this one, and it honestly ignited a sincere curiosity in the spectrum for me, and I hope to further explore the game library of this thing in the future. And rounding out the last of the initial Elite software ports is the Amstrad CPC version, another 80s microcomputer with a solid user base in the UK and Europe, and a pretty capable machine for gaming in its own right. Upon firing this one up, you'll be immediately blasted with an unhinged gabber techno version of the Ghosts and Goblins theme by David Whittaker, a very prolific composer of computer VGM in the 80s. I mean, this is awesome and kind of ahead of its time, but it does get a bit intense, as this is the only song you get and no sound effects. Banger tune aside, the graphics here are alright. They're certainly a bit rough around the edges and not as juicy looking as some other Amstrad titles I've tried, but the game itself at least performs at a fairly consistent speed with just a few moments of slowdown. Once you actually start moving around, the problems accumulate. The jump physics feel a bit floatier than normal, and you can't shoot in the opposite direction of your jump anymore, a staple of the original control capabilities that is sorely missed here, especially considering you die in one hit. Yeah, that armor is just for show, unfortunately, and to top it off, your hitbox is pretty freaking huge, so be ready to embrace death. On the attack side of things, there's only one weapon in the game, the sword, which is finally properly sized for the name, but at least you can fire them off very quickly as long as you don't hit the on-screen projectile limit, so you can mash down some bosses and enemies pretty quickly. Another dangerous hazard comes in the form of the game's unusual screen scrolling. Many Amstrad games utilize hard cuts between single screens rather than full-on scrolling, but here it's somewhere in between, where the screen scrolls when you get near the edge of it, but the game doesn't really pause during this transition, and new enemies will spawn as soon as the viewport has finished moving. Now, it's not the worst idea in theory, but here it's not super consistent as to what pixel it happens on, often leading to some really nasty patterns of potentially unavoidable enemies. And man, these ghost burritos are freaking giant. Another especially tricky enemy was the turret, which sometimes randomly shoots 2 projectiles at once, requiring a perfectly timed forward jump to survive. But if you're wondering about the armors, at least they're basically idiots now, and can be easily mashed down whenever they fly at you. Like the other ports so far, the levels are also trimmed down to 3 in total, likely for storage space concerns. Even little things like grabbing the key at the end of a stage are missing, which doesn't affect the gameplay, but still felt a little weird. There's even a rumored demo build that may have had more stages, but that seems to be lost media for now. Regardless, you do get the graveyard with a unicorn boss, the village with moving platforms and 2 unicorns at the end, and a challenging cave stage and dragon boss to wrap things up. Now, upon beating this DVD logo-ass chump, the game just loops back to level 1 without any real ending or fanfare at all, not even a glimpse of Prin. And seemingly no difficulty bump either, from what I could tell. And that's okay by me, because this one was pretty brutal to learn in the first place. One-hit deaths really escalate the danger, making this game the deadliest port of them all, with 792 piles of Arthur bones created in my nearly 15 hours of hardcore techno-fueled attempts. Yeah, I didn't even listen to different music or anything for this. It may have caused some irreparable damage to me, honestly. In the end, my experience on the Amstrad ended up feeling more like brute forcing through a dangerous puzzle than anything else, which can be rewarding in its own way, but man, you need some patience with this one if you're beating it legit. There is also a fan-made Amstrad project I want to bring up, made in 2018 and actually made for the Amstrad GX4000 model, the company's attempt at a gaming console-like piece of hardware. The boost in specs allow for this version of the game to be considerably closer to the arcade original in terms of content. It has smooth scrolling, sound effects, and a great soundtrack. It's another great example of a labor of love that goes well beyond the original port, and definitely worth a look. Alright, we have survived the elite ports of '86, and man, if you thought those were jank, now we can really dumpster dive into this 1987 conversion for DOS, developed by Pacific Dataworks, who also worked on Capcom's DOS ports of Bionic Commando and Sidearms. And this port is pretty hilarious looking and sounding, but honestly, there is some fun to be had here. Just keep your expectations very low in regards to getting anything like the arcade game. The artwork is very scuffed. Like, what the hell is wrong with Arthur's face? Man, maybe keep that helmet on. Maybe it's an allergic reaction to the PC speaker music. There's no scrolling in this one. Instead, you move from screen to screen, with enemies spawning after the screen is drawn. And the spawn time varies depending on the difficulty mode you pick at the start, with Novice, Intermediate, and Advanced modes available. Novice mode is kind of hilarious, in that you can often just run to the other side of the screen before the enemies even have a chance to do anything. If you're fast enough, you don't even have to kill a single ogre. Now in Intermediate, they spawn a little bit faster and in higher quantity, and Advanced mode escalates the speed even further. I do commend their inclusion of multiple difficulties here. They're all much easier in comparison to the other ports so far, but beating Advanced mode isn't free. The dragons are especially feisty there. Some other janky things to mention. There are different weapons, but they all behave about the same. Even the torch just flies straight forward and doesn't leave a burning spot. And at least the shield still eats projectiles, that's cool. And the controls have been altered significantly. You do have a floaty jump with complete mid-air control to the left and right. You can even hit the down key to land faster. And I don't know what's up with the timer, it just counts upwards, and it doesn't even reset when you start a new game. But finally, something you might have noticed that does give this port a little edge over the others so far. It has all of the levels and bosses from the arcade game. The stage layouts are definitely heavily modified. Sometimes rather confusingly, the same screen might appear twice in a row. But hey, at least all 6 stages are present, even down to a final Astaroth fight in his throne room. Now there's no second loop required for a true ending, and as seems to be the norm, there's no ability to continue. Despite that, this one is way more reasonable to complete, with only the advanced mode getting me hung up for a little while, trying to deal with the insanely unpredictable dragons and ultra-fast Satans. Overall, this port is certainly kind of a disaster, and the change to single screens and mid-air jump controls really suck the core out of what made the arcade game so good. But hey, you know, I laughed a lot getting through this, and definitely had a fun time regardless. (1987) would also see the release of a Japanese computer port, Makaimura for the PC-88, one of the well-established home computer platforms in the 80s made by NEC. And compared to the DOS version, this one at least looks closer to a proper Ghosts and Goblins game, with Arthur and company looking very similar to the Famicom port. And the backgrounds are comparable to the Spectrum, aside from that big brick wall framing the gameplay. And the music is pretty cool too, utilizing the FM synthesis capabilities that later PC-88 models would have, giving us a nice synthy harpsichord-like take on the classic themes of the arcade original. And we've got an attempt at screen scrolling here too, but man, it is really choppy, and I experienced a substantial amount of input lag. The colors are a bit garish as well, so this was a tough one on the eyes overall. But to be fair, it might not look as harsh on a proper vintage CRT. The real kicker on this port, however, it is damn hard. You get 3 lives, no continues, and 2 loops are required for the full ending, and all of the stages are here, and mostly faithful level layouts to the arcade. Nothing major is missing, really. It's a pretty impressive port in that regard, but the screen scrolling and harsh difficulty will really test your patience and can drag the experience down. But like the others, it just takes some consistency and willingness to search for new approaches to familiar challenges. Now, if you do get any extra leeway here, the game at least provides a pretty long window of invincibility frames after you take a hit. And while this port didn't kill me nearly as many times as the Amstrad version, it did take the most time to beat of all the versions, clocking in at nearly 16 hours of playtime. And from what I can tell from digging around online, there was maybe one other Japanese computer port released around this time for Fujitsu's FM7. But I honestly haven't been able to find a dumped version of it to play. I saw a Japanese website that shows a screenshot looking nearly identical to the PC-88 version, so for now I have to assume it might be similar to that. We'll flash forward 3 years now to 1990 and see the grand return of Elite Software, bringing us 2 more conversions, notably released after their ports of the sequel Ghouls and Ghosts the previous year. Looking at the Commodore Amiga version first, we've finally got something that really looks like the original arcade game. The graphics are nearly 1-for-1, the performance and scrolling is nice and smooth, and all the levels are there in the form you'd expect. Mark Cooksey, the composer you might remember from the Commodore 64 version, has also returned on soundtrack duties with something much more familiar, but still utilizing a different sound palette from the arcade. And we can fortunately enjoy sound effects and music at the same time. Now, you might need to tweak some control settings to get this closer to the arcade experience. By default, up is jump, and you can't shoot in the opposite direction after a jump. But you can modify this during the game's installation or with a trainer, and maybe even set up 2-button controls if you're feeling fancy. On the difficulty tip, there are no continues, but you get 7 lives, and there's only 1 loop required to get the ending. so it really wasn't too bad if you're a Ghosts and Goblins veteran. Now, overall, this port is quite good, but if I'm being honest, deep down I was hoping for something a little more weird or cursed, as some Amiga arcade game conversions often tend to be. But for 1990, this was certainly the most arcade-accurate port you could play at home. And there's also another rather recent fan-made Amiga port as well, still undergoing updates even. It's somehow even closer to Arcade Perfect. Pretty impressive. But be warned, it's based on one of the really hard revisions of the arcade ROM. And rounding out the last of the old computer ports is the Atari ST version, again released by Elite Software in 1990, and also after their Ghouls and Ghosts port on the same platform. At least we get something a little different here, with completely redrawn graphics looking distinct from anything else we've seen so far. Man, these unicorns have been hitting the gym. So oftentimes you'll see Amiga and Atari ST ports utilizing the same assets, but that's definitely not the case here. And when you're playing your umpteenth version of the same game, variety is appreciated. Now, the game speed is pretty out of control. I did mess with some different settings to try and find some more authentic way to experience this madness, but I think it's really meant to play this fast. And your attacks feel closer to a machine gun than what you're used to. And man, the fire and the axe weapons are terrible here. Weirdly, this has a cross and a separate shield weapon, with the shield being like a typical long-range attack, while the cross is the short-range projectile destroying one. So this was kind of a tough one at first, but I did find that most of the challenge has been front-loaded into the first 2 stages of the game, and I had a much easier time after that. For one, the plant enemies can block your attacks with their shots, which gets pretty tricky at times, and the village level has some demon spawns that feel completely unavoidable if you get a bad pattern. And I may sound like a broken record by now, but of course, you cannot continue. Luckily, level 3 is weirdly easy. The dragon boss behavior is extremely basic and easy to deal with, and level 4 has a bit of wacky platform problems, but it's not too bad really. Now the game just kinda ends suddenly after level 4 though. It even takes you into Astaroth's throne room and everything, but you don't fight him or do anything at all here, and there's no second loop, you just win. I assume levels had to have been cut for storage reasons, but still an interesting version here, and actually the first Atari ST game I've ever beaten, so that's cool. It's been pretty fun to expand my horizons into all of these computers I didn't grow up with. And it would take a while, but Ghosts and Goblins would finally get its first handheld version in 1999 for the Game Boy Color. And this was also one of those black cartridges compatible with the earlier versions of the Game Boy. This port was developed by Digital Eclipse, a company very experienced in bringing arcade titles to home consoles and handhelds, although weirdly in this case, they have used the NES version as a base here. I won't complain too much about that, since that port was kind of a mess, and they actually cleaned it up quite nicely here, with a much improved frame rate and smooth performance overall, and a redone soundtrack by the prolific Alistair Brimble. It sounds awesome, with some very rich sounding, almost Commodore 64 flavored jams here. Other differences in this port include a password system and a slight drop in difficulty, which is likely a byproduct of redesigning some things thanks to a zoomed-in screen to accommodate for the smaller size. It's not a drastic shift, but you might notice some enemy behaviors have been toned down, such as the ogres not camping the ladders as badly, and they can't shoot downwards at you anymore. And don't get me wrong, this is still tough, and you still gotta beat it twice, but certainly it's a bit more approachable overall. Sadly, you don't get the insane third loop or beyond like we had on the NES game. That would have been very interesting to see here, combined with the smoother game feel. Otherwise, it's pretty faithful to that port, other than the aforementioned screen size tweaks, And it could be a more player-friendly experience to try out if you like. And we've got another handheld version here, this time of the liquid crystal variety. Released in 2005 by Epoch, only in Japan, and as part of a series of micro-sized LCD games paying tribute to classic games. And despite its teeny tiny size, we've still got a proper game to play here with 4 stages, platforming, and multiple enemy types. Level 1 has you automatically running to the right, but you can relocate to different zones along the ground, all while shooting incoming zombies and jumping over pits. Level 2 is a battle with a red armor, where you have to avoid his fireballs and take shots at him while he is vulnerable in the upper left or upper right section of the screen, hopefully stun locking him and making quick work of him. Level 3 is similar to level 1, an auto runner again, but now killer birds are in the mix and appearing from behind. Level 4 is a battle with Astaroth himself, somewhat similar to the armor fight, but he takes more damage and can teleport. Now for what it is, this is actually a pretty fun gameplay loop. And speaking of loops, there is indeed a true ending. But it's not just from a 2-loop clear. You have to first max out the score at 9,990 points and then beat Astaroth. In my case, this took 7 loops to do, since there are a limited amount of points you can collect per stage. So that was a little bit grueling on this tiny little thing. Now you do at least gain an extra life back for each completed loop, but you can't stock more than 3 at once. It's kind of daunting at first, but after enough time you'll notice the patterns are fairly consistent, and then it's just a matter of endurance. Again, I must stress how small this thing is. One fingertip can cover up all of the directional buttons, and on top of that, the noisy texture on the background art makes some things kinda hard to see, as they have a lot of different static images here with the numerous enemy types and positions for Arthur. The sound is pretty pathetic sounding as well, especially if your batteries are getting weak. But hey, you do get this lovely ditty when you finally rescue Prin Prin.
Yeah, sick. We did it. That's it. That's true ending.
And there's one other LCD game I should also mention, but I'm not convinced it actually had Capcom's official blessing, despite some websites and YouTube videos labeling it as a Makaimura game. This is Makai Joe by Bandai, with a clear tribute to Makaimura in its legally distinct artwork. Sadly, I don't have one of these handhelds myself after months of searching, as it looks kinda fun. But again, I'm not convinced it's a true Ghosts 'n Goblins product anyway. Now let's dig even deeper into the exotic under-discussed ports here with some very interesting Java versions for cell phones. The first ones, released in 2004, all feature redrawn sprites that differ depending on the resolution variant. It's pretty cool to see how they crammed things down here. Honestly, this 128 by 128 version looks kind of amazing. On top of the inherent difficulty of using a phone keypad to play, this still has got a challenging bite to it, despite numerous technical limitations on the gameplay and content. It only has 3 levels, and any instance of moving platforms have been removed. And level 1 is a mostly similar graveyard, and level 2 is half ogre house and half cave, and level 3 is a hybrid of the final 2 castle levels. So it's at least pretty cool how they still reference most of the original stages. And you do need to beat 2 loops to get true ending as well, and the second loop has slightly faster projectiles and doubles the number of boss enemies. And this really wasn't nearly as janky as I expected it to be. It runs smoothly for a Java game, and I really only noticed some troublesome input lag on the largest resolution version, where for some reason your jump doesn't happen unless you hold the button for about a half second. 2008 would see yet another Java release with a new title, Ghosts and Goblins Gold. And the 4 years between were somehow not kind to the graphics. They look more like a bad asset flip gone wrong. And the low-resolution variants have some very messy-looking downscaled art. But at least they fixed that jumping issue, so it controls a little bit better. Also added to this is an additional layer of green armor that allows you to take a third hit before dying, which might not sound like much, but it really makes the game exponentially easier. And not to brag or anything, but I got through both loops without continuing on my first playthrough of this game. So if the brutal difficulty of the series has ever put you off in the past, maybe this was the one to try. Alright, and our last one here is a more modern mobile take, released in 2017 for iOS and Android, Ghosts and Goblins Mobile, which was released in tandem with a similar mobile version of Ghouls and Ghosts. It's basically an emulated version of the arcade original, with an essentially one-to-one transfer of its sprites and music, but as you can guess, now we have mandatory touch controls. Yeah, sorry, no Bluetooth controller support here. Now there are lots of layout options to accommodate button placement, mostly making the interface hilariously large and covering up most of the screen. But aside from the cursed touch controls, what I found most interesting here is the game's casual mode, which adds a double jump with mid-air control and parabolic inertia when falling. It goes completely against the physics laws of the original, without really altering the stages or anything, so it gets kinda wild sometimes. Levels 5 and 6 are especially hilarious now, as you can just double jump up through all of the floors instead of running around using ladders like a chump. And one kind of interesting feature here too, you can pause the game and switch weapons back to anything you've previously collected. So you no longer have to fear picking up a torch by accident. Sadly, this has been delisted for a while, but casual mode is definitely a highlight here if you can get it running on an old tablet like I did. And that wraps up all the ports that have been released so far, unless you count these sick Makaimura board games. But we're gonna save these for another time. Stay tuned for that. It's also certainly possible I missed a fan-made remake or two, or maybe something new came out while I was uploading this, so feel free to share any cool ones you've found if that's the case. We'll get into some other cool fan-made original stuff down the road as well, like Ghosts and Goblins 2. In the end, hopefully you found something in here you might want to try yourself, or maybe give the original another shot if it defeated you in the past. Just be courageous, feel the strength, and don't be afraid to die. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time.